We've had some interesting readings today. I'm focusing on both Kings and Mark. I find them both very striking stories in quite different ways. So a question I want you to hold in the back of your mind is, what kind of God? Don't panic, I will elaborate on that during the course of this preach. In the King's reading, we're getting a snapshot story about the prophet Elijah. He's just landed King Ahab with the decree that rain will not fall on the land again until Elijah gives the word for it to. To clarify, God is the real power behind that, but Elijah is just his messenger. So Elijah's now running and has been hiding, and we find him now on his way to Zarephath, as directed by God. He's told he'll find a widow there who's going to supply him with food. Zarephath is a Sidonian town, which was predominantly Gentile territory, so not the usual hangout for an Israelite prophet. So Elijah finds this widow and asks for water to drink and some food to eat. Whilst the widow is more than happy to oblige with him with a drink of water, she falters at the mention of food and admits that she's only got a little bit of flour and oil left, and she's going to cook her last little bread meal for her and her son, and then they're going to die. That's going to be their final meal, and they're going to starve. Elijah, rather surprisingly, I think, doesn't particularly seem fazed by this at all, and replies, "Don't be afraid. You go do that, make your last meal, but could you bring me some first before you do that?" He follows on by saying that as surely as the Lord lives, the flour and the oil won't run out until rain falls on the land. Now, I have mixed feelings about this story, and some quite strong reflex reactions to it. Is it okay for Elijah to ask this widow to give him some of her last meal? Is it okay for God to get Elijah to ask the widow to give Elijah some of her last meal? That was my first question. What kind of God? There it is. I said I'd elaborate on it. What kind of God does that? And am I comfortable with God being like that? Now, you might be feeling a bit uncomfortable now with that line of thinking. You might be feeling more than that. You might be closer to mildly or downright outraged at that sort of questioning. But those are the kind of questions that as a Christian, you feel yourself thinking, and instantly you feel terrible. And you think, am I allowed to even entertain that question? Am I an awful person? Am I lacking faith? But as someone very wise said to me recently, if you can't ask those questions in church, where can you ask them? If you can't pose and explore and mull over things that are difficult and you aren't sure about, doubts you have, in this setting, amongst others who are on this faith journey with Jesus, what's the point? Where better to share questions and doubts than amongst others who can walk with you, sit with you, and help you unpick them? Trust me, I've done it both ways. I've sat with questions like that for a long time, which was not great. And I've also begun to ask people when I have those questions, and I can tell you that the second one is a much better option. And as James rightly pointed out to me when I sat in his office earlier this week and said, I don't know how I feel about God asking Elijah to do that, there was more to the story than that. Elijah didn't force her to give him the last of her food. He asked. But more than that, he shared with her God's promise of goodness in the face of hardship and despair. And the widow took a step of faith in a God she probably didn't know much about. I'm pretty sure they were living in a drought, so the promise that the flour and oil wouldn't run out until the rain came is substantially than if that same promise was given to us today in the UK, where rain is pretty much like a daily occurrence, and you never know when the heavens are just going to open and it's going to downpour on you. The promise of, yeah, your food's going to last till about tomorrow, and then that's it. But for this widow and Elijah, rain hadn't fallen for a very long time, and I think the drought lasted about 3 years. You can double check that with someone who's more of a Bible scholar than I am. And true to his promise, the widow's jar of oil didn't run out for her or her son, and she was able to feed her son, and Elijah for that whole time. The second story we're focusing on is jumping all the way forwards to Jesus' time. Jesus is sat with his disciples across from where all the crowds put their money into the treasury, their offerings. He's people watching, basically. Who here loves people watching? I really love people watching. I do it when I'm sitting in cafes. I do it when I'm on the train, when I'm driving around. I just find people fascinating. And I love to wonder and imagine what their stories are. So I don't blame Jesus for people watching. He has the slight edge on the rest of us in that he already knows everything about everyone. But back to the story, he's sat with his friends. He's seen the religious leaders come along with pomp and self-importance, and many other rich people arrive to make a big show of putting in a lot of money. And then a poor widow comes along. You can imagine maybe she shuffled in, trying to make herself look small and not to draw attention to herself. Jesus, though, is watching her, and he watches her put all the coins into the box. And he turns to his disciples, gathers them in, and says, "Look at that widow. She put in more than all the others." You can imagine the disciples probably look a bit confused, glance at each other and like, is he serious? Like, did he not see that she just put like a little bit in? But Jesus says, all those other people have loads of money. They put in large amounts, yes, but out of their wealth. But this woman, she's poor. She has virtually nothing. And out of her poverty, she put in everything she had to live on. She now literally has nothing. I've always found this story incredibly poignant. In some ways, I don't even know why, but it always hits me and always makes me want to cry. For the woman, for her bravery, for her outstanding faith and selflessness, for her belief that God was worth it, even though society had forgotten her. In Deuteronomy, there are multiple express commands to care for and provide for the widows in the community. And yet, just a few verses earlier, Jesus says, the teachers of the law who stride around with pomp have devoured the widows' houses. For all they teach the letter of the law, they neglect to care for others. This poor widow has nothing left because her community failed to uphold practices that would have safeguarded her. Now, with Jesus in the midst, I'm sure that was not the end of her story, because where society failed her, Jesus never would. This story also makes me ask myself, what do I have to give? And does the fear of it not being much or enough stop me from giving at all? I don't just mean in monetary terms. I want us to think about it in a broader sense. We can give in many different ways. Some of you will know that I come from a large family. I have 6 siblings, and they are all older than me. Let me tell you, it makes it very difficult to be the first to do very many things. Why do you think I have blue hair? Nobody else did this one. But in all seriousness, I often find that I compare myself to them. They're further ahead in life. They do so much better at stuff. They've achieved so much more. Now, before I continue, I do want to say that that's not something that they put on me or that my parents put on me. It's just a fact of human life. I guess it's that sort of natural insecurity and worry that I have. They actually spend a lot of time telling me that I should stress about it less and just do what I'm doing. But often I think, no, I won't do that. I won't give to that. I won't join and help out with this because someone else could do it much better than I could. And what if I try and I flunk it and I look silly, and it would have just been better if someone else who knew what they were doing had just carried on. I remember when applying for a job, it might have been this one, can't quite remember, but I said to my mum, I don't know if I should, because one of my siblings would do much better at it than I would. And my mum looked at me and said, which of your brothers and sisters do you actually think would be better suited to this than you? I didn't have an answer for her, still don't. But my point is, sometimes we perceive what we have to offer as being so small that we choose not to give it all. What do you have to give? Does the fear and doubt in yourself stop you from giving? Do you sometimes think that what you have to give is so small, so insignificant in your own eyes? Or you think that someone else could do it better, so you leave them to it? But how many people are missing out when you let that stop you? This widow literally put in 2 copper pennies, and Jesus said that she had given more than anyone else who had put in hundreds of silver and gold coins. We aren't, and neither is anyone else, the judge of how much what we give is worth. Jesus is. This story, not everyone has the same giving capacity, and that's okay. The beautiful truth is that we all do have the capacity to give. We all have something to offer, different things, which is the beauty and joy of community. You don't know the impact of your gifts on those around you, so don't discount them. The widow gave everything she had to Jesus days before Jesus gave everything for the world. So I ask again, what kind of God? What kind of God asks a widow to share her last meal? What kind of God thanks a widow for giving everything that she had? What kind of God might ask us for everything? The God who gave everything. And as we go into a time of sharing communion, isn't that the most poignant point of all? Before I finish, I want to read this poem to you. 2 copper pennies, that's all she had to give. To the world, that didn't seem much. To the religious leaders, it was downright embarrassing, perhaps worse than putting nothing in at all. But 2 copper, and yet, to Jesus, it was everything. To Jesus, it was her heart. To Jesus, she gave more than anyone else. 2 copper pennies, her gift in full, not in part. Some days later, Jesus walked his lonely road. They paid for him in silver, the rich who had given out of wealth. But I wonder in that moment if it wasn't the 2 copper pennies he remembered, the widow's all from a heart of faith, as he freely gave his all for the world to receive his grace. Would you accept my 2 copper pennies, Jesus? I know it doesn't seem like much, but I hope it comes from a heart of trust. Help me give my all, Jesus, to you, the one who gave it all for us.